Welcome to the Beyond the Bestseller podcast. I'm your host, Kelly Schuknecht, and today's guest is Sharon B. Heaton, the author of Liftoff. She has an amazing story. Cannot wait for you to hear it. So let's get into it. Hi, Sharon. Thank you so much for joining me on the Beyond the Bestseller podcast. I have a copy of your book sitting right here and cannot wait to get into this with you. So, if you would just start us out, I'd love for you to share, to introduce yourself and share who you are and kind of what led you to write your book.
Okay. Pleasure to be here with you, Kelly. Thank you so much for the invitation. My name is Sharon Heaton, and I'm the CEO and founder of a company called SB Liftoff. And SB Liftoff is a national M&A advisory firm, which is just a way of saying that we help people buy and sell companies. About 80% of our work is done on the sell side. And over the years, I've had conversations with business owners, and I realized that there was a lot of similarity in what questions they were asking. So at some point, I decided, why don't I sit down and simply write the questions that people are asking and then answer them and try and do it for a business owner who's smart, but maybe doesn't have a huge amount of experience in M&A. So that's what the book is. It's a way of trying to get information out there to people that I think is really quite useful.
So I love that approach. That's one of the things I talk to people about when it comes to writing a book is start thinking about the questions that people ask you all the time. Like people want to write a book, but they don't know where to start. And like that's the best. I love that you just said that because that's the best way to do it is just there are questions you're answering all the time in your business and you can answer those questions and put together a book that solves that problem for people. um oh,
Well,
go ahead.
honestly, I didn't start there. I started by writing the book that I thought made sense. I got about 30 to 40% through with it, and then said, this is terrible. This may not be readable to other people. I'm not sure what the theme is. How does this make sense? And I had to kick back and say, what am I doing and why am I doing it? And that's when I started coming up with a list of questions. And I said, now this makes sense. So, had I spoken to you beforehand, I could have skipped a lot of that effort,
Yep.
but I had to come there my own way.
Well, that's okay. We all have to do that. So, speaking of coming there your own way, so I selfishly want to know how you started your own business and kind of what prompted you to do that. So we'll come back to your book because that's I want to talk to you about your book, but I also just want to hear about your kind of journey and how you went out on your own and did that.
Absolutely. Well, fortunately, this is the second business that I've created. I formed a investment bank with some colleagues back in 2009, and we grew that, and I sold it in 2014. And as I was sitting there trying to figure out, so now what do I want to do with my life? Um, a friend came to me and asked me to help her sell her business. And now I'd been doing M&A work for decades. I started off at large law firms and, working with publicly traded companies. This was truly my first experience dealing with the founder owner. And I found it was both incredibly different and very satisfying. I mean, the M&A skills are pretty much the same M&A skills. They do differ between the publicly traded and privately held, but dealing with the founder owner was a totally different experience.
Hmm.
And I was hooked. So I started thinking about it. I formed the corporate entity in 2016. Didn't seriously get started until 2018,
Oh, wow.
but we've been working on it since that time, and we've been growing and developing, and I think developing a bit of a positive reputation in the industry, and that's really very satisfying.
That's I oh, you're like my new hero. I I like want to follow you and I learned so much about what you're doing. I love this. So your book was actually published by Forbes, correct?
Correct.
So you talked about writing it. How did you get it picked up by Forbes?
Forbes actually has a process, and you apply, and about 4,000 people apply, and they accept, I don't know, 100 or 200. So clearly, luck was on my side. I think that I might have been talking about a subject that was not necessarily focused on by a lot of people. And so, hey, a little bit of good writing and a little bit of luck.
Yeah. Um Now that you say that, I have met with the Forbes. I don't remember what the position is that talks with people, but somebody that I was working for before Forbes has reached out. So I understand that process. That's interesting. Did you already have the book written then and pitched it to them, or did you have a conversation with them and then write it based on kind of what they were looking for?
In order to do the submission, I had to give kind of a 3 or 4 page summary. I
Okay.
did that 3 or 4 page summary, and it was accepted on that basis. And then I sat down to write that. And it was only after I was writing that I said, "Oh, that's terrible. Don't do that. That's not good for you. It's not good for your audience. Let's see if we can change this." So I had to go to Forbes and say, "Listen, I'm thinking about restructuring it as follows." And they were wonderful. They could not have been more supportive. And I think they liked the second idea more than the first one anyway.
Oh, nice. Well, that worked out well.
Very
Um,
well.
you also have this nice little sticker on there that it's an Amazon bestseller, so it has done well.
It has
Um,
done well.
who is your book for? So it's about uh tell me a little bit about like the ideal reader for this book. Like who would get the most out of reading this book?
This book is really designed for business owners, people who own their own company. Usually they formed their own company, or maybe they bought a company and grew it from there. And they are experts in their company. They know everything that's going on there. But they've been doing it now for 5, 10, 20, 30 years, whatever it is. And they're thinking about what do they want to do next in their life. It's one of the reasons why my company is called SB Liftoff, because we want people lifting off to their next goal in life.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a very big leap for people to go from having the company to thinking about transferring that company. And while folks like me think it's just ordinary course of business, it's the world in which we live, but that's not true for most business owners. So what I wanted to do was put information out there in a way that was very accessible, so that people who are smart, I mean, business owners who have created a company and they now have 10 million, 20 million, 30 million, 5 million in revenue, they've done something right. They've done something hard.
Yeah.
But this is something that they have no background and skills in. And it's also going to be most likely the most significant financial transaction of their life. So simultaneously having it be incredibly important financially and to have an area where there's just a lot of unknowns, it felt like providing some sunlight into that process could be very beneficial.
Yeah. So the I don't know that if we shared the actual title, so I want to share that. So it's Lift Off 12 Things to Know Before Selling Your Business. So what is like your favorite tip out of that? Your number one tip about what a business owner should know before selling their business?
Um, the that's more limited question, so I'm going to answer that question. Um, because I think what a business owner needs to know is that somebody coming in is going to look at the company differently than they will. Most business owners treat their company appropriately so, like it's a child.
Mm-hmm.
They basically had it as a baby, and then it grew up and it became a toddler, and then, God forbid, it became a teenager. Now it's a company that is ongoing and has revenue and has profits, and they're very proud of it, legitimately so. I also find that business owners are quite humble about the things that they did right and the things that they did wrong. But they've gone through quite a process in having that company grow, and they feel very emotional about it. It's often like a child, and figuring out how are you going to sell that is a leap of faith that it's very challenging for these business owners. So the
Mm-hmm.
first thing really for business owners is to understand that the buyer or buyers coming in are not going to understand what they're looking at. So you really, as the seller, need to explain and be patient with them and not think that they're dumb because they don't know what you already know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. So I'm seeing this through so many different lenses because for one, just starting my own business, I'm hoping that someday I'm going to need to read this as, my guide for the process, right? But also I just came from basically an acquisition. So the company that I was with for 7 years was acquired, and really it was a I'm curious about your opinion about this, but it was a 5-year transition that merger process. And so they're only just 2.5 years through it. But I've also known other businesses where it was a pretty like the business sells and it's immediate. Like, so I'm curious about your opinion about like that transition period for selling your baby. And if you have a recommendation for business owners on, maybe it's not a one size fits all thing, but I'm just curious, like how you see that. What's the best case scenario for that transition?
Um, Let me give you a little bit of the breadth of what's available here, because a lot of it's going to depend upon what the seller wants. When you sell your house, you go to closing, somebody gives you the cash value of the purchase price, and you walk out the door, dropping the keys off on the table, and you're done. That's not the way a sale of a company goes. Very rarely does the seller get 100% of the purchase price in close at the closing. So there's other ways of getting compensated, and we can talk about that if you're interested in it. But as a result, it's much more of a baton handoff. It's not an empty building that somebody can walk into and make their own. A company has people involved. You have processes. There's all sorts of history there. And the buyer, no matter how much due diligence they've done prior to the closing, will not know as much as the seller does on the day of closing.
Mm-hmm.
So the
Mm-hmm.
buyer generally wants the seller to be around for some time period. Now, truth is, most sellers make terrible employees. They've been around for so many years making their own decisions and calling the shots that it's
Mm-hmm.
very challenging to go to a role where
Yeah.
somebody else is making those decisions. And in fact, the buyer might make a different decision than the seller would have. And that can be very painful for the seller. I generally tell our sellers, you should you should want the company to be successful after you transfer it. If you don't, then I'm not sure that we're the right people to work for you. Because we believe that while we want to do right by the seller and we want to do right by the buyer, we also want to do right by the company. And that company is a golden baton. And there's a relay race going on. And the goal is to transfer it from the seller to the buyer without that golden baton hitting the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And ways of doing that is for the seller to really be helpful to the buyer. That transition period can go on as short as a month. 3 to 6 months is kind of typical. It's not unusual for a seller to stay for a longer period of time. But the first thing that happens during that transition is that the seller should have already been thinking about what are the parts of their job they like and what are the things that they don't like. And there should be arrangements made for the parts that they don't like to get transferred to the buyer sooner rather than later.
Huh.
And the parts that they do like to be able to stay there. Basically, there's only really three parts to a company. You've got to bring in the work, you've got to do the work, and you've got to deal with the back office stuff. Well, very rarely does a buyer want the seller dealing with the back office issues. You might for a transition to understand how things are working, but basically the buyer's going to take that over. Sellers will then either be very involved in the business development side, or they'll be very involved on the delivery of services or products side. And that then becomes a discussion as to, do you want to continue that, in what role? Sometimes the seller wants to actually be on the front lines and be involved in business development and bringing in that work. Sometimes they want to be an advisor and they want to say, okay, here's what's going to happen. Here's what I would recommend you do, but I'm not going to be the one who's actually doing it.
Hmm.
That gets negotiated between the buyer and the seller. So it is kind of a little sui generis, but there are some norms in the industry.
Yeah, that's really fascinating to me. Is that just through conversations with both the buyer and seller that you determine kind of what that timeline looks like, what the seller's involvement will be? Like how does that get determined?
Well, I'm going to start and talk about this only from the sell side. So when we're on the sell side, we're doing a lot of work with that seller before we're going to market. We're looking to see if the company is actually able to be transferred. Is it ready to be sold? Is the seller ready to sell? And in order to do a transaction, both the company and the owner need to be ready. And we could talk about that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So we spend a fair amount of time working on those issues. And during that time period, I am repeatedly asking that seller, what do you want? Why are you looking to sell the company? What's the reason? What do you want your life to be? Do you want to continue to have involvement in the company? And if so, at what level? If you don't want to have continuing involvement, tough. The buyer is looking at the seller to say, is the seller trying to get away from a problem? Is there a problem that the seller knows about that the buyer doesn't? And if the seller is looking to quickly jog away from the company immediately after the transfer, the buyer gets nervous. So we talk to our sellers to say, you've got to be prepared to do a transition. And pretty much everybody is. Almost all sellers want their company to be successful after a transfer. In fact, on the one or two occasions where a seller was not asked to participate, they were hurt. They were
Mm-hmm.
like, how is this buyer going to do anything unless they understand what happened in 2022
Right.
or what the background is of this client? So it is very wise for the seller to have thought through what it is they want before going to market and be working with advisors who are looking to make that happen for them.
Yeah. Sharon, is there a specific type of company that you typically work with, or is it any company that is going to sell? Is there like a
Um,
specific industry that you work in?
yes. Basically, SB Liftoff works for B2B services or products companies.
Got it.
So if it's, we don't do consumer based, we don't do restaurants, cash industries, et cetera. Basically B2B.
Yeah.
Over time, because I'm in Northern Virginia, we have developed a deep expertise in federal government contracting. So pretty much all of our clients have a minimum of 10 million in revenue to about 100 million in revenue. And most of our deals are in the 10 million to 50 million enterprise value.
Okay.
And as I said, a lot of our companies are in the GovCon sector. And GovCon is huge. I mean, the GovCon industry is massive. So we could be working on IT, we could be working on healthcare, so there's a quite deal of variety in that. It just so happens that it's all the commercial issues plus an entire regulatory level on top of that to be in federal GovCon.
Wow. I so I love what you're doing. And like I said, you're like my new hero because I just feel like as a woman in the workplace, there just aren't that many women around us. You know, we were talking earlier about just there just are I don't know, there's not that many women mentors, I feel like. So I am inspired by what you're doing and just the fact that you did this on your own and wrote this book and all of these great things. How was it for you in your career? Where did you find inspiration from other women? Like, or maybe you didn't need that, but I feel inspired by women like you who just have done really amazing things um and
It's very
and
kind of you.
this is
I've
not a
taken
like
inspiration.
this world that you're in is it has to be a very male dominated world, I would
It is.
imagine. Yeah.
It is. I would say in my career, I'm usually I'm very used to being the only woman in the room,
Hmm.
or one of very few.
Yep.
I started my career off in finance at a time where there weren't a lot of women in finance.
Yep.
So that was kind of, I was often the only woman there. From there, I was very heavily involved in the energy industry. Well, the energy industry was very, very male during that time
Yes.
period. As I was getting started on creating SB Liftoff, it occurred to me that being a woman could, in fact, be a disadvantage. Most business owners are men, and how would they feel about the most important financial transaction being done by a woman? And what kind of resistance would I get from that? I think I've come to the conclusion that it's actually not been a hindrance and, in fact, may be a help. Very often, these founder owned businesses are a husband and wife,
Hmm.
and the wife sometimes gets ignored. And so having somebody else at the table who is a woman can be very helpful to her. And I find that the men are incredibly open. So I've certainly done deals where the only people on the other side of the table were men, both buyers and sellers. And it's been nothing but a positive experience for me. And I haven't gotten many complaints. So I think that the being a woman has been helpful in terms of the philosophy of my company, which I'd very much like to talk about a little bit, but
Yeah.
it has been less of an issue in terms of people not wanting to work with us because I'm a woman.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, I've had that experience being the only woman in the room, or one of few, like you said. And it is interesting. You look around and go, oh, like, what happened here? And I always, you know, I don't know. I don't know why that happens. I mean, I think a lot of women opt out of careers because, they stay home with kids and then they're set back a little bit. But then also I think there's other things at play there. But it is interesting, like just that being a woman has a different impact in your business. You mentioned that you do want to talk about the philosophy behind your business. So I'd love to hear that.
Yes. Hey, listen, I'm in mergers and acquisitions, and there are a few areas that are considered more cutthroat than M&A. We've taken a totally different approach to it. And our view is that these transactions need to be a win for both the buyer and the seller. And one of the key elements of the book is that buyers need to have empathy for sellers, and sellers need to have empathy for buyers. And that empathy is, in fact, a superpower. It's not simply something that makes you a better person and allows you to be thoughtful to other people's emotions, but rather, if you're in a negotiation and you're able to see things from the perspective of the person you're negotiating with, the likelihood of coming to a successful conclusion is substantially increased. If it's there's 10 cents on the table and I want nine, well, you're always going to have a limited pie and everybody's fighting over it, and that's not a good place to be. If in fact you can figure out how to expand that pie, in fact, it's not simply that the buyer and the seller are in conflict on all issues, rather that they may care about different issues. And if you can be empathetic to the other side, you can get what you want while also allowing them to get what they want, which is a win-win for everybody. So this idea that this should not be a win-lose proposition, but rather should be a win-win, that the way to get there is empathy for both sides of the transaction is a very philosophy than what most M&A advisors bring to their clients.
Well, and that's interesting that as a woman, you can bring a different perspective to that industry or to that service where, it's different. And I think, yeah, it's a different perspective, a different approach. So Sharon, I don't know, what is the most inspirational story of this like a M&A that you worked on?
I have several. Let me start off by saying that anybody who's man or woman, it's hard to start a company. It's really hard. And companies that start generally don't make it 5 years. The few make 5 years and are profitable are in the very rare category. So if you've got a company and it's been profitable and you've been going on for more than 5 years, you already won. That is a fantastic place to be. And your company is a machine. It takes in revenue, and when it's working properly, it throws off profits. Real trick is, can you make that machine valuable to somebody else so that somebody wants to buy that from you? So that not only do you get the profits during the company, you get the liquidity event of transferring it. And that's where the real wealth generation comes in. So I just find myself being totally amazed at people who start companies and grow them and are incredibly successful and are able to then lift off to the next stage in life. One of the earliest deals I did was a company that was majority owned by a woman, and it was her and her husband. Um, Both of them were high school graduates, but neither of them went to college. They started a company in an area that they knew something about, which was installing safes in banks. How did they know about it? Long story, but they did. They started working on that, and the company was doing pretty well. And then the Americans with Disabilities Act was enacted, and that required all ATMs to be every bank had to have an ATM that was suitable for somebody who was in a wheelchair, which
Oh.
means that ATMs had to be lowered. They had been installing safes, and they said, wow, our client base, banks, need to have a lot of construction done for these ATMs. So they went into that business. Over the next 25 years, they grew their company to being well over $80 million in revenue. These are two high school graduates. They figured out everything. They figured out complicated laws, how to read contracts, how to hire people, how to open up in different states. They were amazing at doing this. And they did very, very well. When I started working with them, it was a little bit like working with a teenager because the company was growing so rapidly that as soon as I figured out what the company was, it was now something different. It was like when I bought shoes for my 17-year-old son. By the time I got them home, he was already out, had
Yeah.
already outgrown them. Um, going with these people through this process was an extremely emotional process for them, and as a result, for me as well. It was a very big transaction. There were a lot of different component parts to it. And keeping them both focused on the business aspects, but also the personal aspects as to what was going to be meaningful to them and what they wanted to do with the company afterwards. So we were delighted when that transaction got done. And on the anniversary of that closing, I speak to that couple every year, just kind of talking about how their life is and how life has changed. And, it's a very important relationship to me, and I think to them as well.
I love that. I'm glad I asked you that question. I think that's a great story. And well, thank you so much, Sharon, for being on. I do want to ask, is there any way, so I will link to your book in the show notes, but is there anything else you want me to share as far as how people can reach you, or any other resources you want me to share?
The best way to reach me is through my email, which is Heaton, Sharon Heaton, Heaton at sbliftoff.com. And of course, there's contact information in the book as well. It's truly been a pleasure speaking with you, and I hope this is interesting to the audience.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you.
For a community of women writers to support and inspire you on your journey, join the Author Power Circle. Connect weekly with fellow authors, stay accountable, and move your book forward in an encouraging community. Learn more at kellyshuckneck.com.